republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So the first item on the agenda would be the approval of the minutes for our last meeting. Are any corrections needed, or can we just have that approved?
I move we approve the minutes of the last meeting.
Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. So now we're on to new business, the budget calendar process overview. Tom.
Yeah, I'm just going to share my screen real quickly here. And I thought it would be good. Obviously, we have board members on the call, but these meetings are broadcast to the public as well. And we don't know who's watching. But I thought it would be good for Joe Mancini and Craig and myself, but mainly Joe, to walk through what happens from the time Joe Mancini tells principals and directors, hey, begin putting together your numbers, to the time the board gets the budget book. What does that period of time look like? And we'll promise to be brief, but I thought from a process standpoint, it would be beneficial. So Joe, you can see my screen, I assume, Joe, and maybe kind of walk us through it.
So we obviously kick it off pretty early in the year, trying to give the principals as much time as humanly possible, principals and department heads. So typically around the start of the second week of October, we kick out the budget instructions to the administrators. Now the budget instructions are it's a needs-based approach to budgeting. I don't give them a specific target. I just ask them to come back with information about 6 weeks later, as detailed as possible. Right. So generalities such as, well, I went up, or I kept it the same because that's what I think I'm going to spend next year. They don't really work. We do ask them to justify their budgets. So right around the week before Thanksgiving, the budget numbers come back to me. I then work over the following 2 weekends, which usually includes Thanksgiving break, to pull everything together so that we can start meeting with the principals in the first week of December. So the first week of December, we meet with everybody and go over every single line in everybody's budget. The conversations are typically resources based. The staffing really doesn't get discussed that early. That's typically
what does resources based mean?
So what do they want to accomplish?
You said needs based, and now you say resources based, and that sounds to me like a conflict.
Not really. I guess there's multiple conversations that occur. What's that?
Joe, logically it does.
Okay. Well, I'm not going to slice apart my words. Having said that, we do try and ask the individuals to justify every dollar that they're spending. So after they give us the input, after I pull everything up into some sort of summary format, we then start meeting with the principals on a person-by-person basis and we walk through their budgets.
So can I talk a little bit about that, Joe? Do you mind if I jump in? So basically, what occurs is Joe, Craig, and myself, who have the broad view of the entire operation, obviously, we literally meet with each principal individually and each director individually. So that would be, obviously, Joe and Craig would be two of those people, but that would include director of special services, director of IT, food service, obviously facilities, athletics, all of those various departments in addition to our 5 building leaders. And, there's a lot of pushback and justification that occurs. So they walk us through the request, the rationale, and then, we're asking clarifying questions and getting kind of a picture in our head of how this is beginning to shape up, and we begin to develop, some priorities. And then I'll hand it back to Joe.
No, I'm just curious about
that occurs. So they walk us through the request,
and then the reference also to resources. I mean, how do you reconcile those two? They're opposed. It's either one or the other.
Well, I guess an individual's basis.
I'm just trying to understand.
So, for example, a principal may feel that something is needs, right? Like they need to do this. They need to redo the what the hell's the word I'm looking for? It's something that Joan brought up in the was brought up in the past.
Or maybe that they need walkie-talkies or something like that.
I'm not good with the vernacular, but yeah, something. Let's say something like that. But if from a resource perspective, we don't have the need, we don't have the ability to meet those needs, we wouldn't be satisfying that. We would actually be saying no to them. So I guess it depends on where you're talking about whose needs they are. So everyone has what they perceive to be their needs. The conversation on resources happens when it gets up to our level.
Well, that's different. And I would expect that at the input level, it would be needs-based. And
Correct.
Then it gets reviewed not only as to needs, but as to resources. But certainly you don't want the input to be influenced by resources.
You're 100% correct, Greg.
Okay.
So after we have the meetings with all the principals, myself, Tom, and Craig kind of lock ourselves in my office for, God, it feels like 2 to 3 weeks, and just hammer out the budgets. We follow up with the principals and the department heads about additional questions. We go over all the resource assumptions as far as actual utilities and trends. We try and make sure that each number that we have that we're putting forward is defensible, and then we start really diving into headcount, specifically on the teacher ranks. So on the teacher front, we do it on a person-by-person placement basis. So we will look at Quaker Hill Elementary and we'll say there are X number of regular ed teachers. We will put the actual people in with their actual step, their salary expectations for the following year. So we do get relatively granular when it comes to the head count. Those are very defensible. The only assumptions that ever happen on the head count side is any kind of turnover that we have. When we have turnover, we traditionally budget for a mid-step teacher for the next year's budget. We're fortunate in Waterford. We actually do know who's going to retire. The union contract requires that they notify us by December 1st. So it does allow us some additional granularity that doesn't exist in other.
One of the questions that we always get at our meetings, before the Board of Finance or the RTM or even our own internal budget hearings, is the accuracy of budgeting mid-step. What's our historical experience there?
So you've had good years and bad years. It really depends on what you're hiring for. And we can get a little more specific on it, but the scenario I'll present, Greg, is the areas where it's where there's limited availability. So if you're looking to hire a high school chemistry teacher, odds are they're going to be hired higher than mid-step. Elementary teachers, you've traditionally been bringing them in, mid-career. You've been pretty close. But anytime you've had anytime we've had any specialties that we've had to hire for, it feels like we've been hiring at higher steps.
Yeah. So
how does it work though under the contract? You either have so much years of experience, you have this degree or that degree, whatever your. How does our need or supply and demand, simply put, supply and demand, how does that factor into our collective bargaining agreement?
Yeah, so I have the ability when we hire a teacher, it's in the teacher's contract, to place the teacher on a particular step. It doesn't necessarily need to be commensurate with experience.
Okay.
So for example, in an elementary opening, we might have 400 applicants, and that's not necessarily an exaggeration. That is an abundant certification. And we talk with our principals about where we want to spend our money as a district. I know I'm going to have to, if I've got a physics teacher or a French teacher that's left, I know that's going to cost some money. And what I look at is basically the aggregate. This is the amount of money we've budgeted and spent, and the goal is to stay within those parameters. To your question about how we've done historically, we did that analysis a couple of years ago for an RTM member who requested it. And it was about a 3 or 5 year look back. I forget the exact metric. And we were right on around Masters 5, Masters 6. When you iron out the physics teacher with the grade 2 teacher and, the 6th grade math teacher and that, it eventually irons out around a Masters 5, Masters 6, right in there.
That's fair. All right, so after myself, Tom, and Craig go through, hash out where the staffing levels are looking like we want to recommend to you, we start pulling together the budget book, and we hammer that out. We go through multiple iterations of that over a 7 to 10 day period. Then we ultimately forward on the superintendent's recommended budget to the Board of Ed about middle of June. I'm sorry, middle to late January. And then once it's in your guys' queue, we go through our 3 or 4 meetings and forward it on to the Board of Finance, and then ultimately onto the RTM. But it's basically takes all year, right? I mean, it's a 7-month process.
That time from early December to January 21st, end of January, we're literally, I venture to say, every day working on this, narrowing it down, prioritizing, we're going to fund this over that. We go back to the Board of Ed assumptions that y'all approved last meeting, to make sure we're in alignment with those. There's a lot of decision making. As I said last year, before the budget ever got to the Board of Ed, about 1.5% had been reduced by me from the requests from principals and directors. So those are the machinations and conversations that occur over the course of that month.
And it's important to understand that with a $50 million budget, I mean, we're spending a lot of time trying to understand it, making sure that we understand what's moving and why. There's a lot of stories that goes on with the budgeting process. We have a relatively good handle on it, and I think we provide a quality product. But it's a big budget. You're talking $50 million.
There was an article in the Wall Street Journal today about the deficits that states are facing because of the COVID-19 crisis. And Connecticut was the lead state in the article. I forget the billions of dollars that were going to be shortfall projected over a period of time, but it was billions, and it far exceeded the rainy day fund. I'm just wondering if that is something that this committee and the administration needs to factor into its budget assumptions. If not this year, then certainly next year, because the money isn't there, and the shortfall across all the states is just astronomical. So,
do you mean, Greg, that we might face a shortfall in state funding?
Yes, yeah, but I think that ripples down to the local level too.
Yeah, that's what I mean in terms of the monies that come to the town of Waterford from.
I think that to assume that the state is going to continue to be able to fund us at the levels that it has in the past may be whistling in the dark.
So I have good news and bad news on that front. The bad news is you're probably right. The good news part of that is the state over the last, I've been here, this is year 6. Over the last 5 years has diminished their contribution to the town of Waterford in the form of the education cost sharing grant from about $1.8 million to about $300,000. And I say that's good news in a sense that if they eliminated all of it, the impact on the town is certainly $300,000, but it's not at the rate some other communities might face.
So we're almost immune from that.
In some ways, yeah. I mean, 94, I did this analysis a couple years ago with Joe. It's either 94 or 95% of our budget is locally funded.
Yeah, that actually sounds right.
When you factor in excess, I mean, education cost sharing is about 3.25%, and then you have the excess cost IDA grant is, X amount. It's about somewhere around 95% locally funded, which is.
Of course, the corollary, though, is that the ability of the, excuse me, the local population to actually
Correct.
meet their tax burdens because of how they've been impacted too.
Absolutely. And, right. And we're talking about education. Who knows what other shortfalls the town will face in state grants, in other areas of their operation.
Yeah.
Yeah. You guys are fortunate in Waterford where you don't receive a whole lot on either the town or the board side for state aid. Having said that, I mean, we take your message. Greg, was that a Today article?
Yes. Front page.
What are they forecasting? About 2 billion?
Oh, I forget the number, but I think it was up around 8
billion.
It ran through several years.
Oh, yeah. I mean, one good thing about the state of Connecticut is the way our taxes are structured, because it's an income-based approach. We're relatively well insulated by comparison to some of the ones that rely solely on sales tax and travel. But having said that, I mean, yeah, everyone's going to have tighter budgets the next few years.
A big part.
What's that?
A sales tax is still a big part. Well,
Yeah, Florida, that's 40%.
Okay, sorry. Go ahead, Tom. Didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, no, I think it's relevant discussion. I mean, I think, it's an exhaustive process in how this committee will dovetail into that as numbers roll in throughout the next, I don't know, 7 or 8 weeks would be to really walk you through as those numbers roll in. So, what we're facing come into January, beginning of February. We've talked about what do future meetings of this committee look like? Oh, I think we have, I don't know, five more scheduled or 6 more. Would be really walking you through, okay, the utility numbers are in. Let's walk through that so you understand that. Now tuition numbers are in. Let's walk through that. Obviously, staffing will be later in the process as we won't know those numbers definitively until around December 1st. I think as those numbers roll in, and that really gets into agenda item number 2. I don't think it would be prudent to go through all 70 slides with you. That's not the intent, but I'll defer to Mr. Benoit.
I think I would agree with you because you and I have chatted or corresponded, and it's basically what we do every year. But I'd be interested in how the RTM, how that budget workshop went. Did we get any feedback, any signals as to what their thinking is?
I don't think that we necessarily got signals about what they're thinking. I think it was appreciated. Over half the RTM was new last November. I think 14 out of the 24 were new last election. So a lot of the education that occurred on the education budget left with that crew who moved on to other endeavors. So it really is a re-education process around it. I think the setup, I would encourage our board members to go through this at their leisure. The setup of what's in each section, the methodology we use for budgeting. If you would humor me for just a minute, maybe I can literally walk through what we did with them. We really went through what was in the section, instructional services, which is mainly our teacher staffing. And we went through with them, what's our budgeting methodology? How do we arrive at the numbers that we arrive at in that section? We talked about what are the drivers, what accounts for fluctuations in this particular category, what drives it up, what drives it down, and what have we done through our budget process to mitigate the increases in this particular section. So I do think that was valuable. And we did that for all 13 or 14 sections of our budget. So I do think it was beneficial. I seemed appreciative.
Yeah, and I want to commend you. I think that's a great move to do that. It certainly opens up channels of communication and just gets the ball rolling so much earlier. And it's just a good thing to do. I'm sure it was well received.
Tom, what was the participation rate?
I think just about everybody was there. Yeah,
Good.
it was a regular meeting, so they embedded, it wasn't like a standalone, oh, the board's coming to do this. We were an agenda item on their agenda, so I would say everybody was there.
Great, great.
Just to give a little bit of feedback, so the long range financial planning group has met. Mr. Muckle, who I believe is chairing it, had asked and kind of set a target of about 2% for the next decade. I don't know whether that's reasonable or not. What I said to him was, we have to watch out for inflation. Monetary policy, like what we've seen over the last year, lends itself to higher inflation. But the number that they threw out was 2%.
What impact would inflation potentially have on our budget?
So I'm not sure.
I'll be honest, I wouldn't, not everybody has the same knowledge base you might have.
Right. So there's short term and long term, right? So inflation on the short term is just going to affect your commodities. It's not going to touch, for example, your contracts, such as teachers, paras, custodians, general maintainers. It takes years for those actually to get embedded. Municipalities, they're very slow on the increasing for inflation, but they're also very slow on the decreasing when the economy starts to slow down. So there's always a little bit of a tailwind to us. So short term, you would expect items such as paper, such as cleaning supplies, such as your food prices for your cafeteria, your fuel prices, items like that theoretically could go up. But you'd be the next round of contracts before you started to see inflation in salaries. Having said that, we could see something very similar to what you saw in 2007, 2008, where they implemented quantitative easing, which is essentially to stem inflation by using the Fed to borrow more money. It's very hard to come off interest rates like we're at right now. So I don't know. I mean, I will tell you, monetary policy like this devalues the US dollar, which leads to inflation.
But hasn't there been an historical disconnect between what we would expect from that monetary easing and what we've actually experienced in terms of inflation?
They were pretty spot on in like 2007, 2008. I don't know how you issue and run these kind of deficits like we've run, honestly, even the last 7 years, and not ultimately see the US dollar devalue. What?
It's the new monetary theory.
I'll tell you, it defies logic.
Yeah. Well,
we couldn't. I'll tell you, we couldn't run the board like this.
We don't know.
Well, again, I would encourage every board member to go through that. And again, for most, if not all of you, it'll be review, but it's a good primer heading into budget season that lets you know kind of at the central office level, how do we arrive at the numbers that we arrive at? In terms of future meetings, does it make sense as numbers roll in a particular section to walk through that with you?
That's what I was going to ask you and the committee.
We want to be responsive to your needs, obviously.
Right. I mean, Chris was very concerned that we, stay up to date. How do the committee members feel? I mean, how frequently do we need to meet? Basically we had a week or 2 weeks between our last two meetings. So what do you think?
Our normal schedule is what, monthly?
Pretty much, yeah. Deb, how do you feel?
I guess it depends on how much information is coming in between. Is it worth the time and I don't know that anybody can predict that.
Yeah, I mean, our next meeting is tentatively scheduled for November 12th. That's 2 weeks from now. I don't think the landscape will have changed much.
Right.
Numbers aren't due back to Joe until after that. So I don't know that we'll have much of an update for you.
Well, when would the best time be when you would have an update? And maybe that would be the most efficient time to schedule a meeting, rather than just going to November 12th or whatever the date was. What do you think, Tom?
Yeah, I mean, Joe, we should have some, even though budgets aren't due to you until November 20th, I think Thursday, the 19th, potentially, we could have some utility numbers, some of those budget sections that you don't need principals and directors for. And then you have Thanksgiving, and then
We won't,
we're into early December.
we won't know the teacher's contract until December, right?
Correct. Yeah. So that would be one of the last sections we'd be able to review. I would say we shoot for the 19th, Joe.
That's fine.
Okay, panel okay with that?
Yep.
Okay. Sounds good. I don't think we have to memorialize that in a motion or anything. We can just do that. Anything else that we need to discuss tonight?
Not from administration. Certainly we're here. We want to be responsive.
Any members have any of the committee have any concerns they want to address? Okay. So let's just adjourn and thank you, Tom and Joe and everyone else. Good job.
Thank you.
A motion to adjourn, please.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Okay, we're adjourned. Thank you again.
Hi, everybody.
Have a